So, for early life, right, they lived without oxygen. Now, early plants breathed in or used CO2, right, carbon dioxide, and expelled oxygen the way plants do now. And this was absorbed by oceans and rocks, right? Well, these little plants lived in oceans. But about 2.5 billion years ago, these oceans and rocks became saturated with oxygen. They really couldn't soak up any more oxygen. And so oxygen began to be built up in the atmosphere, and this led to really dramatic changes in life on Earth, killing off older life forms that had metabolism such that oxygen was toxic, and leading to the development of new ones. Now, as oxygen increased in the atmosphere, we had organisms that adapted to breathe oxygen, they had more energy available to them, and you could make more complex multicellular life forms. And about 540 million years ago, there was an explosion in the development of new life forms that created almost all of the basic branches of the modern tree of life, and that was called the Cambrian explosion. And let's take a look at a video.
A mere 542 million years ago, the Earth's landscape was a barren wilderness. 4 billion years after the planet's creation, no animals lived on the land. The most developed organisms were simple animals living in the oceans. Something extraordinary was happening in the seas. Over a period of 20 million years, at the beginning of a period called the Cambrian, an explosion of new animals developed below the water's surface. These later gave rise to most of the diversity of animal life that now exists on Earth. But the cause of this sudden burst of life, which geologists call the Cambrian explosion, remains a mystery.
The Cambrian explosion was really biology's big bang. Things went from moving very slowly along the seafloor without any predation to suddenly all the different type of ecologies that we find today. Life literally exploded.
What triggered the Cambrian explosion? We don't really know. There are many different possibilities, different hypotheses, and we've got to remember that cause and effect are often difficult to disentangle.
So what happened exactly? To try to understand it, you need to look a little bit farther back in the history of the Earth, to the Ediacaran period, which preceded the Cambrian. It was during this time that the first large animals evolved, but they were shell-less.
Before the Cambrian, we go into what's called the Ediacaran times, and this is an extraordinary interval where we have the seafloor populated by basically weird creatures, and quite frankly, we're not quite sure whether they're animals or something else entirely. These are organisms which seem to have mostly survived on absorbing nutrients from the seawater itself. They may not have had any gut, some of them may be able to move. These creatures are principally soft-bodied, that is, they have no skeleton. And then they seem to more or less disappear as the Cambrian explosion kicks off.
After 45 million years of slow evolution, those weird creatures suddenly disappeared, to be replaced by those of the Cambrian. The first echinoderms appeared 540 million years ago. Starfish and sea urchins are their descendants. Brachiopods followed after some 10 million years. The trilobite, the Cambrian's most iconic fossil, joined the explosion towards its end. It showed up a few million years later. There are a number of theories about what happened that enabled these creatures to appear.
There's a theory, a hypothesis, suggesting that one of the factors that holding back the evolution of animal is the availability of oxygen. Photosynthesizers, things like cyanobacteria, algae, plants, make oxygen and organic carbon, and once the organic carbon is buried in the sediment, the oxygen is released in the ocean and the atmosphere for animals to use.
Prior to the Cambrian explosion, oxygen levels may have been too low for large, active animals to survive. But once those levels increased, larger animals were able to survive and proliferate.
Then animals burst and diversified in many, many different forms.
Evidence to support this theory of higher oxygen levels is scarce, but there may be a link to a phenomenon called snowball Earth. This was a long period of recurrent ice ages. When the glaciers melted, huge amounts of rock were exposed and eroded, pouring nutrients into the water. That encouraged the growth of photosynthetic algae, which would have caused oxygen levels to rise. But the last of the giant ice ages ended around 90 million years before the Cambrian.
Things like oxygen levels, which are fairly clearly increasing during this interval close to the Cambrian explosion, must have been important. But oxygen was accumulating already much before then.
Another theory for why the Cambrian explosion occurred is that minerals became increasingly available in the oceans due to post-glacial erosion. These could have been used for the construction of shells. But Cambrian shells were made from a range of materials. This suggests that they were the result of parallel evolution in different animal lines, not a single innovation. That means something encouraged them to develop on more than one occasion, and shells are costly to make. It's unlikely mere abundance of minerals would have been enough. Could a transformative innovation in the animals themselves be the explanation? One such innovation could be bilateral symmetry, which concentrates nerves and sense organs at an animal's front and encourages the development of an efficient gut with a mouth and an anus.
We're inventing nervous systems, we're inventing eyes and other sensory systems. We're learning how to move fast, how to swim effectively. So you have a whole cascade of feedbacks, and it's really trying to pinpoint, if you like, the trigger versus all the other consequences which flowed from that initial point.
The Cambrian explosion happens after a series of events, in my opinion. First, you need to have genetic building blocks to make an animal. You also need oxygen to support animals, to support animal metabolism. But that alone is not sufficient either. You also need a mechanism to drive the system into a runaway situation. You need to make the system work very fast. And one of the mechanism to drive the system to a runaway situation is ecological feedback.
Ecological feedback, in this sense, refers to the interaction between predator and prey. During the Cambrian, predators evolved new mechanisms, such as vision, to track down their lunch.
A good part of what's happening in the Cambrian explosion must be the motor of ecological change. And one of the really big, important gear changes, so to speak, to pursue that analogy, is in the way in which predators and prey interact. Part of the explanation for the widespread development of skeletons must be the rise of predators. And we see other evidence in terms of mouth parts, even gut content sometimes. You can see what one animal has swallowed. And all these things suggest that we are moving into an ecology which is radically different from anything ever before. An integral part of this is the evolution of nervous systems. And nervous systems, of course, include ultimately brains, and ultimately, of course, when animals come onto land, and sometimes even in the oceans, big brains which start thinking. Aha.
Some believe the emergence of vision during the Cambrian period caused the rate of ecological change to accelerate.
I believe that vision must have played a significant role. I think the fact that that event coincides with the start of the Cambrian explosion possibly could indicate that vision was actually the only thing that was required to trigger the Cambrian explosion. Light today is the most powerful stimulus of all, and vision is the most powerful sense. When that's unleashed on the world for the first time, it's going to create chaos.
Now, the capability to sense light has been there for a long time. Even some bacteria has a way to sense light. Many microorganisms have a way to sense light. But the very complex eyes, they can very precisely position the prey. They can view 3 dimensions and allow the predators to very effectively catch the prey. That's a very important part of the ecological feedback that allows the Cambrian explosion to happen in a very rapid rate.
Now we have this pinpoint accuracy. A predator could spot a prey, and also because it's got its fast swimming part and hard part itself, it could get to that animal instantly and tear it apart. So that means now there's huge selection pressures on all those soft-bodied animals to evolve defences against this, which means really hard parts. It means shields and spines, and also hard swimming parts to swim away itself.
But not everyone agrees.
Now, there's absolutely no doubt that eyes did evolve as part of the Cambrian explosion. My reservation with it is that eyes come in all sorts of shapes and forms, and primitive eyes are really little more than what we call eye spots. They're sensitive really to sort of shades of grey and white, and no more than that. And that's quite sufficient for the great majority of animals. They don't actually make an image on their eye. Whereas I think one of the dangers, if I may say so, of seeing evolution through our eyes is we have fantastically well-adapted eyes, which are the product of millions of years of evolution. And there's little doubt that those really sophisticated eyes only evolved a bit later.
There is one other possibility. The disappearance of the Ediacaran creatures may be the cause, not the consequence, of the Cambrian explosion. The explosion resembles the recovery from a mass extinction. Signs of a catastrophe 542 million years ago could easily have vanished by now, but that doesn't mean one didn't happen. Perhaps the bilateral ancestors of today's animals were simply hiding in the shadows of the Ediacaran world until opportunity knocked. Whatever actually did happen, though, they took that opportunity, with momentous consequences for the future.
Humans are direct descendants of the Cambrian explosion. We have primitive fish from deposits such as the Burgess Shale in Canada, which we can really say are our ancestors.
From the human point of view, the true significance of the Cambrian explosion is that Homo sapiens wouldn't be here if it hadn't happened.
Okay, so we saw on the slide here that your book is claiming that basically this is because the Cambrian explosion happened because of an increase in oxygen, but in general, that's not the agreed upon reason, right? There was a lot of debate about it, what exactly caused this huge increase in the number of animals. And of course, the beginnings of all the types of animals we have now were created during or evolved during the Cambrian explosion. Okay, so they mentioned the Burgess Shale just very, very briefly in this video. And the great thing about the Burgess Shale and what it is a fossil bed that's up in Canada that had some amazing fossils of animals that lived during the mid-Cambrian period. The sort of swimming, weird-looking creature with the two eye stalks that you saw in the video is a recreation of one of these animals that were found in these fossil beds. And the great thing about the fossil beds was that it didn't just preserve the hard parts of the animals, which is what you usually see in a fossil. Usually it's kind of the hard parts, the bones, the shells, that are preserved in a fossil. But in the Burgess Shale, they really had preservation of a lot of the different parts of the animal, some of the soft parts as well. So it's an amazing find, and it has really sparked the imagination of a lot of people who've studied it. So I would recommend to you that you take a look at this book. It's extremely cheap here at Barnes & Noble, $1.99 for this book. A great book by Stephen Jay Gould, who's died pretty recently, was a professor of evolution, I believe at Harvard. Anyway, he's a great writer, and this book is all about the animals of the Burgess Shale. It's an amazing thing. So I love this book when I was your age. So go get the book. Super cheap. You really don't have any excuse. Okay, so let's go back to our slides. All right, so let's do a couple of questions. And actually, this question, we haven't covered this material, but I'm just using this question to talk about this. Kind of doesn't fit in anywhere, really. Remember, we talked about how genes are passed down from parents to children, but that is not the only way the genetic material can exchange hands, so to speak. In fact, bacteria can exchange genetic material, one bacterium to the other, and this is how they become resistant to antibiotics. So when you take antibiotics and you don't take it all, you may leave some bacteria around who've survived the attack, right? And the genes that allowed them to survive the attack, they literally can transfer to another bacteria. We can't do that, right? So it's called lateral gene transfer, and it's really only available to bacteria. Anyway, so I point that out. Okay, now What term best explains this process? So here's a process. A group of rare yellowish ants are destroyed accidentally when their home was plowed over at a farm, while a group of brown ants are not disturbed by the farm worker. This leads to a greater ratio of brown ants than yellow ants in the next generation, right? What is that? Well, that's genetic drift. Kind of doesn't sound like that would be the right name for it, but it is. Okay. Try a question yourself. Please pause the video.